Chapter 9. Church didn't skip a beat. You're sure? The woman nodded. Yes, we've looked. But Church was already striding away, calling out orders as he moved. Crespi followed, as confused as he had been all day. It wasn't possible, not with the supposedly escape-proof pens, the monitoring systems. Unless somebody let it out. The thought chilled him. Out the alert immediately. Williams, secure the floor, then get to the trackers. Briggs, inform Admiral Thaves and, Church looked around quickly. Webster, get me a head count. A chorus of yes sirs as Church hurried up the steps to the viewing deck and back towards the guarded entry. Crespi hurried to catch up as the aging doctor barked orders at the sentries. Secure this door, get reinforcements and cover the lab perimeter. Yes, sir. Church was moving at a half run now, and Crespi jogged along behind him, through a maze of turns and twists to what he assumed would be the monitoring centre. He couldn't help the fear that they would turn a corner, and there it would be, long and black and shrieking for blood. He shook the thought and picked up his pace. This was a day for the books, all right. Unfucking believable. It was all happening too fast. The memories stirred by that drone, the drone itself, the bizarre twist that he suddenly wanted to be here, doing this. No, not this. Research is one thing. Hunting down killing machines isn't what I want. Never again. Church was talking, trying to explain. Impossible, but we've prepared for the impossible. The aliens are all wearing tracking devices, so it's just a matter of time. He trailed off as they turned down one more corridor and entered one of the rooms. The walls were covered with dozens of small vid units, watched closely by several worried techs. Crespi saw Sharon McGinnis standing behind one of the seated men, her knuckles white against the back of his chair. She looked up tensely as the two men hurried into the room. "Situation!" Church called out. A voice blared out from one of the intercom systems. "Colonel Dr. Church, all personnel are accounted for, except Lieutenant Mortensen." Church stepped over to a grid monitor. "Get Mortensen on camera. I'll find the alien." Crespi ran a hand through his hair and looked around helplessly. There was nothing for him to do except watch and wait. McGinnis seemed to be in the same boat, and he caught her gaze for a moment, saw the frustration there before they both turned back to the screens. "What's the status?" A booming voice filled the room as Admiral Thaves stormed in, his face red. Church held up one hand, effectively silencing him and reaffirming Crespi's suspicions. Church was in charge here, rank aside. Church pointed at the 3 dots on the gridded screen. "There are the kennelled ones." He glanced down as the vid monitor beneath lit up. And there's Mortensen. What the devil is he doing? Crespi peered over Church's shoulder. A thin, middle-aged man in a work uniform knelt amid a pile of decontamination suits. As the audio became clear, Crespi could tell that the man was humming. Church went back to the upper screen, talking softly to himself as the station's prints flicked by rapidly. "Oh where has my little dog?" "There. Freeze it." He jabbed one finger at the small red dot. "In that breaker room." Right next to Mortensen. The tech seated to Church's left spoke quickly. "Shall I put Mortensen on comm, sir?" Church shook his head. "Let me do it. That alien is only 20 yards away, if that. If Mortensen panics, it'll be over in a millisecond." Church reached over and tapped a button. "Mortensen, this is Colonel Dr. Church." The man's reaction would have been funny, if not for the circumstances. He jerked to his feet and looked around wildly, shocked by the voice from nowhere, dropping the tool he'd held. Yes, sir. Colonel Dr. Church, sir." He regained his composure, looked up at the nearest camera. Church spoke calmly, firmly. "I want you to go directly to the compensator room in SJ-12. Confusion played across Mortensen's thin features. "Right away, sir." "Yes, immediately. I want you there in 6 seconds. Behind Crespi, Thaves muttered angrily. "What is that nitwit doing, futzing around with those suits?" The vid image switched, showed Mortensen as he walked quickly down a hallway corridor. He was on one of the lower levels of the station, primarily a maintenance and storage area. Mortensen hurried, but didn't seem frightened. Crespi felt his heart pounding with each of the tech's steps. God, if he had any idea. Mortensen walked into the compressor room and addressed the camera there, set at eye level just inside the door. "I'm here, sir. Do you copy?" Church cracked a tight grin. "Big and bold, Mortensen. Shut the door behind you and lock it, please." Mortensen glanced away for a second and then back to the camera. The audio clearly picked up the sound of the door sliding firmly shut. Crespi could feel the combined tension in the monitor room give way. He exhaled heavily, not realizing until then that he had been holding his breath. "Yes, sir. Anything else?" Church rolled his head back. "Yes. Give thanks. You just had a close squeak." Mortensen frowned. "What's the problem, sir?" The Admiral stepped forward and shouted at the video image. "This is Admiral Thaves. What the hell were you doing with those decon suits?" Mortensen shrank back from the comm and spoke nervously. "I was changing the ear filters, sir." "On whose authority?" "Station's orders, sir. Is there a problem?" Crespi had looked away, almost embarrassed by Thaves' blustering reaction to the crisis. What he saw made him spin back to the screen, terrified. A moving red dot. Before he could speak, he saw it. They all saw it, suddenly dropping into the video image directly behind the unknowing Mortensen. "God," Crespi whispered. The escape drone hung upside down, perhaps supported by some unseen pipe overhead. First its shiny long head, the dripping teeth, and the spindly black arm as it reached. Church screamed first, the others in the room echoing the words. "Mortensen, get out of there!" Still, he didn't know. The thin-faced man held up his hands in apology, addressed the comm. "But sir, I was just—" He didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't finish, as those sharp talons wrapped around his throat and lifted him as easily as a man lifts a feather. He let out a strangled cry, not knowing what had him, what pulled him closer to the extending jaws. His choked scream cut off as the rod of the alien's inner teeth shot forward, into and through the back of his skull. It gave as easily as wet tissue, and the image was suddenly blasted red, his blood on the lens. Then there was only red, and the vaguest image of movement behind the crimson veil. Sickening wet noises, the sound of gristle being chewed blaring out into the stunned room. Church reached over and shut off the audio. He looked away from the muted redness and spoke softly. "Hawkins, you and Stockdale suit up and subdue that creature." Thaves spoke angrily, but his face was pale. "What was that man doing down there in the first place? Station's orders, my ass." Church glanced at him. "Sir, if I may respectfully submit, whatever he was doing there is now a matter of secondary importance." Crespi wanted to be sick. Church's voice was calm, only the slightest undertone of tension. The muted, bleary picture was one of gnashing teeth and thick, bloody wetness. Thaves turned towards the door, seeming to regain some of his bluster. "Church, I expect the results of a comprehensive investigation in my hands by 0800 tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Church said quietly. He turned back to the screen, expressionless, watched the obscured movements for a moment. Finally, he sighed, pointed at one of the suited technicians. "Blackman, you and—" McGinnis had moved to join them. Church looked at her. "Who are you?" "Sharon McGinnis, sir, TFC." Church cocked an eyebrow at her, and something like recognition flashed through his gaze. McGinnis. Whatever it was gone. Church cleared his throat and went on. "Blackman, you and McGinnis confirm that the alien has been reconfined, and then I want you to cordon off Sector SJ and begin a surface analysis." He looked down at the tech, who was seated in front of the monitor, a burly, dark-skinned man. "Williams, Clean and close the lab. I want live guards at the kennel." "Yes, sir." Church stood for a moment, seemingly lost in thought, one hand against his chin. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn. Crespi felt some sympathy for him. The doctor had done all he'd been able to do, and it wasn't enough. And you know what that feels like, don't you? Church glanced up at Crespi. "I'll meet you in the lab in 8 hours. He seemed about to say more, but then turned and slowly walked away. He looked beaten, a man who'd lost everything. "Certainly. I'll be in my quarters," said Crespi, and Church waved half-heartedly over one shoulder in response, before exiting. Crespi stood there, feeling depressed and worn out. He glanced at his watch and sighed. Barely 2 hours into his new assignment, and more had happened already than had occurred in the last 2 years of his work on Earth. Suddenly he felt certain that he shouldn't have come, that he was foolish to have taken an assignment he'd known nothing about. He felt almost nostalgic for that vague anxiety he'd had that morning on the transport ship, because at least he hadn't been here, on board this station. There was something wrong here, something deadly wrong. "Ease up, Crespi. Things will work out. You're just having a bad day." No, Lieutenant Mortensen had had a bad day. He was just in a very dark and shitty mood, and what he needed was to go sit down somewhere and try to relax. Crespi sighed again and went to find his quarters. McGinnis hurried down the dingy corridor, her heart pounding. She mentally called out the numbers of each door she passed, praying that Crespi would be home. 85, 87 there, A89. She stopped in front of his quarters, took a deep breath. She'd have to take it slow, no blurting out accusations that she couldn't back up. What she knew, deep down, and what she could prove, were still separate things. Another deep breath, and she punched the buzzer. After a brief pause, Crespi's voice floated out over the comm. "Yes?" "It's Lieutenant McGinnis, sir." "Come in, McGinnis." Crespi sat to the side of a small, faded couch against the wall of his room. She glanced around briefly. Officers' quarters were bigger, a few extra chairs, but nothing to write home about. "May I sit down, sir?" Crespi nodded, gesturing vaguely to the couch, his face pale. Mortensen's death was only a few hours old. "I thought you'd still be at the accident site." McGinnis sat down next to him, pushed her hair back behind her ears. "We did some prelim and specification, and now the sweeps are down there." Crespi's gaze sharpened, perhaps at the tension in her voice. "Find anything?" She spoke calmly and clearly. The tracking device on the escaped alien had been partially cut off. Cut, as with a blade. "We found it in the breaker room. No alien residue." Crespi stared at her, then lowered his head into his hands. "Oh boy." McGinnis went on. "In the generator room we found a substance smeared on the pipes where the alien was hiding. Smelled like pheromone." Crespi kept his head down. "I don't think I want to hear this," he mumbled. "It gets worse. Mortensen was there on station's orders." "There." Crespi looked up, frowned. She met his gaze. "The kennel door was opened by the station too. You're saying that this was a deliberate killing?" "It sure looks that way, sir." She waited, watched his incredulity turn, could almost see a sharp decisiveness come into his eyes. And then he asked the question that she had most hoped for, had desperately wanted to be asked. "Can you unscramble the station code and trace that order on the main line?" She paused, not wanting to seem too eager. This was the tricky part, and she hoped that Crespi would bite. Without him, she was strictly on her own. "Not without authorization." He nodded, made the decision without blinking. "You have it. Sub rosa, McGinnis, and don't get caught. Report only to me. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "I want this to be our little secret," he said, and smiled briefly, dismissively. She stood and walked out, waiting until the door closed before she let out her own smile. The trap was set. Church would never know what hit him. Paul Church steepled his fingers against his chin and nodded slowly, watching as Crespi brought his meeting to an end. "I want this to be our little secret," he said, his low voice somewhat muffled sounding as it crackled out over the video's comm. The microphone needed to be replaced. Church would have to see to that. Church leaned back in his office chair as McGinnis left Crespi's room, still nodding. He'd figured on something like this from the good doctor. In fact, he would have been surprised if Crespi or one of his underlings hadn't done a bit of digging. The question was, how to use it. It was moot at this point. Not enough had happened to worry about trump cards. But all information was useful, and he filed it away under things to remember. A secret, to be sure. Church wouldn't tell a soul.